Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I came in on the evening hop from Boeing Field to Tacoma Narrows in a loud, stubby commuter that smelled like de-icer and old coffee. The contracting company issued me a blue soft case for my uniforms and a binder of laminated SOPs, so new the plastic edges still bit my fingers. It was supposed to be a simple 2-week rotation to the island. McNeil, a name locals say with a small shrug, like the weather, fill a vacancy while a veteran took leave. I had 3 months out of academy, a badge that looked heavier than it felt, and a quiet promise to myself that I'd keep my head down, learn the rhythms, and not be the rookie who gave everyone extra paperwork. The van from Narrows slid onto I-5 for 2 exits, then dropped to surface streets along the water. The driver was a corrections sergeant named Marcus Bell, who wore his uniform like an ironed opinion. He pointed through the windshield toward the dark belt of Puget Sound and the low sodium lamps of Steilacoom. "You'll get the smell of creosote and salt in your clothes," he said. "Don't bother fighting it. Ferry's tied up at the dock just west of town." His radio, a black Motorola APX with a rubber antenna cap, and our contractor's label, muttered with casual traffic I didn't know how to parse yet. Unit 2 on perimeter, Code 4 on a transport, maintenance clearing a work order at the battery hall. I mentally rehearsed call signs and reminders to speak in short blocks, thumb 7 seconds on the PTT at most, leave room for dispatch to breathe. The sound was flat as a brushed coin, and the sky threw back the last leftovers of sunset. It felt like a place designed to be cut off. The island appeared only as a deeper shade of black against the water. The ferry, company gray, flat deck, cabin tucked low, showed a thin rectangle of warm light at the wheelhouse, and 2 deckhands in reflective bibs moving like metronomes. We drove aboard, and the ramp clanged up, chains crossing like a drawbridge on a toy castle. The deckhand took a long look at my face before he clipped the chalk. "First time?" he asked, without judgment. I confessed it, and he smiled like he'd expected it. "Don't worry, the island's boring, whole point of it." The ferry pushed off, the prop wash curled white in the dark, and the town lights slid away as if someone turned the dimmer down. All facilities claimed to be self-contained, but the island took that promise literally. The map on the wall in the administrative building looked like a small industrial town. A water plant, a power substation with its fence double-wrapped, workshops, a medical clinic, the dorms for staff rotations, 3 housing units set back behind wire and concrete, and a long road that stubbed out into a pier for the ferry and a smaller work float for maintenance boats. Between those dots were trees and wind, and a parade of gulls that seemed to be holding a union meeting at all hours. Warden Ruth Calder met us in a vestibule that smelled like chilled mop water. She shook my hand and studied me the way the ferry deckhand did, searching for the creases of newness. "We run quiet," she said. "We run on keys, on time, and on clean hands. Everything else takes care of itself." Orientation the next morning was a tour in the language of doors. "This lock is fail secure. Lose power, it stays shut. That one's mag-held and will release on power loss, but the crash bar still needs the manual. These are your color-coded key sets for this unit, but you don't take the red emergency ring past the sally port because if you drop it, the world ends and the report never will." The control room was a square of reinforced glass and fatigue lighting, stainless consoles under tempered glass, and a desk with 2 APX radios on chargers like black sleeping insects. The monitors grew a wall of night views, corridors, rec yards, the ferry pier, the maintenance float, the staff dorm. I learned names like a slow echo: Officer Dana June on C Wing, Officer Han on graveyard, Nurse R11 on medical, and the rule that nothing happened at speed unless it was a lie or an emergency. The inmates, when I saw them, were surprisingly ordinary. Time sands people down. Unit A was medium custody, men with calendars and calendars after their calendars. Unit B had the ancient ones, walkers and quiet chess games that looked like arguments but weren't. Unit C held the alert ones who had decided to be good employees of a system they neither loved nor trusted. There were no yards in the movie sense, no high towers with long rifles, just concrete runs under camera, chain link topped with coil, and a wind that smelled like cold pennies. One man, Miguel Del Rio, trustee, kitchen, had the posture of a person who had decided to be useful and had collected 100 tiny privileges as a result. He showed me how to coax the temperamental dishwasher to reset without tripping the breaker. "You'd be amazed," he said, "what solves itself if the machine thinks you're paying attention." The first 2 days were quiet enough to make me believe in the brochure. Then the comms began to fray. The internet circuit, a microwave hop bolted to a steel mast above admin, started throwing alarms on the network screen. IT in Tacoma couldn't remote in. Dispatch on the mainland trunked system warned of regional network instability, which translated into the radio dropping to simple conventional channels with their familiar hiss. Warden Calder's voice grew more clipped, and the ferry schedule, supposed to be as faithful as tide tables, went irregular. The Steilacoom landing called in a mechanical delay. When Marcus Bell shrugged at me, it said he'd seen a dozen of those, and none had lasted long. By the fourth sunset, the ferry didn't show at all. The pier cameras recorded only night water and the snouts of pilings. Calder ordered food service adjusted to stretch stores, told maintenance to keep both generators fueled and exercise them on the hour, and made us run a paired check on every external door. She said, like a weather report, that the mainland was triaging a public health concern, and our job was to hold the island steady. She did not say what the concern was. Nurse Ari quietly increased temperature checks at intake, and even though there was no intake, we lined up anyway. That night, in the staff dorm corridor, I passed Officer Ralston leaning against the wall as if the wall had leaned on him first. He looked at me like he was listening to something far away. His skin had a shallow sheen like resin. The next morning, we were on hand radios only. Channel 1 for operations, Channel 2 for admin, Channel 3 is the safety net, and the telephones were a museum exhibit. Warden Calder called a muster and laid a hand on a table as if it were a gear shift. "We are not a hospital. We are not a news desk," she said. "We are a custody facility on an island. The protocols were designed for this. We are going to follow them." Marcus met my eyes across the room and picked something invisible from the corner of his mouth. A nervous habit, he later admitted, left over from chewing sunflower seeds on patrol. In the corridor after, his voice dropped a color. "The mainland isn't answering because they've got their own fire, so we keep ours from spreading." I learned what fire meant at 3:17 when the radios snapped to life with a tone you only hear during drills. "Signal 100, Control said. "All radio traffic restricted. Code 3 to Staff Dorm 2. That's the kind of language that pushes you from sleep to shoes without the stuff in between. We moved fast, but not loud, because loud in a prison is an alarm you can't turn off. Officer Ralston, the one who'd leaned like the wall, was sitting in the hallway back against his door, head tilted. His eyes didn't track. His breath was a slow tide. Ari was there, gloved up, his voice the kind people use in NICUs and after storms. "Corey," he said, using the name like a lighthouse, "we're going to check your temperature. Can you look at me?" When Corey looked, it was like his head had to remember how. His skin was warm enough that my hand a foot away could feel it. He reached up in a flat, searching gesture that never quite focused. We've all been taught what infected looks like by movies that can't afford to be subtle. The real thing is smaller and, for a while, more devastating. Corey wasn't wild, he wasn't raging. He was off by a degree that made your bones complain. Ari's thermometer blinked, and he did the small automatic math of Celsius to Fahrenheit, and back again like that would make a new number. "We isolate," he said, toward Warden Calder, who had arrived without her hair, finding time to obey. "Staff dorm Sallyport, no restraints unless he reaches." Calder nodded once, an old, heavy nod with dead weight in it, and Marcus knelt, hands out, voice low. "Corey, we're going to move you to medical to help you sleep this off." It was a tidy plan until Corey heard, or thought he heard, something. He turned his head and everything else followed by a fraction of a second, like a falling shelf. His right hand came up, fingers flexed. The movement wasn't a grab so much as a search. He stood like he'd forgotten the intermediate steps, and when Ari put a hand to guide his elbow, he turned toward the contact so fast the air felt like it moved first. Marcus blocked, calm as a porch post, and we brought Corey down in a way the Academy would approve of. Pressure points and shoulder control and voices like winter coats. Corey didn't bite or claw, he didn't curse. He moved toward the loudest sound as if that was home. He was strong where it mattered, and weak in the places that make a fight dramatic. I kept saying his name like I could hook him with it. For a second, it felt like he looked at me like I was a radio station he knew but couldn't tune. Ari sedated him with a dose that should have dropped a linebacker to sleep. Warden Calder authorized the staff dorm Sallyport as an isolation room. We placed Corey there with a plastic mattress, a blanket, a water bottle, and a motion detector we borrowed from maintenance. Ari wrote the date and time on a bright orange tag and taped it to the door. It looked like the label you put on a suitcase you hope to see again. By afternoon, it wasn't just Corey. Officer Hahn began to lag on his rounds, fingers tapping his radio like it had a heart rate. He stopped answering with words, only clicks, one for yes, two for no, then none at all. Dana June held composure like a graduate class, finished a hall check, turned the corner, and froze in a posture that said she'd heard a sound only she could hear, eyes going glossy. Warden Calder said the word quarantine without feeling, and watched the ferry pier camera on the main display like she could order a ship to appear with the blade of her gaze. The yard went silent in that special way it does when news leaks under doors, and the people who live by rumor suddenly decide to listen instead of talk. Miguel, the trustee, balled towels with methodical neatness, like he could arrange reality by folding it correctly. On the second night of it, I began to understand that we had two completely different problems. The first was mechanical: power, water, food, and time. The second was the kind you can't log, because it's made of people. The infected guards were not, at first, dangerous in the showy way that clears hallways. They were dangerous because they moved toward sound, reacted to touch like it was a command, and did not process words no matter how carefully we arranged them. They kept their basic strength and lost the governor that tells you when to stop pushing. We discovered the pattern by accident when a PA speaker banged, and 3 of them in the Sallyport stood from sleep as if a drill had fired in the concrete. Ari began to speak of neurology in tight, airless sideline debates with himself. "Hypersynchrony," he said. "Auditory entrainment. We're tuning forks and something struck us." We still had prisoners to clothe, feed, and account for. The cells stayed secured. The electronic control system, a well-used workhorse chassis nobody had bothered to replace because it always worked, kept doing its job. Unit officers, most of them veterans who'd learned their own hearts the hard way, walked runways with measured steps and measured language. Marcus pulled me aside near the control desk and put a mug of coffee between my hands like a piece of gear. "Listen, the inmates aren't the threat right now," he said simply. "We are if we get this wrong. We keep our heads, we keep our keys." He told me about a riot he'd lived through in a different facility, how the first mistake hadn't been made with a punch, but with a lost ring of keys. Keys are freedom. To everyone. By morning, the island had decided, in that quiet way, that the ferry was a myth. The radios had narrowed to an island-sized conversation. The regional dispatch screen glowed idle. The microwave link lights blinked amber. Warden Calder moved through the building like a smart missile, issuing discrete instructions that were all versions of the same order. Maintain. She refused to explain the mainland's silence or the nature of the illness beyond phrases like influenza-like and short-term disorientation. She turned down Miguel when he asked to organize inmate cleaning shifts to help medical, and she told Ari to preserve every sedative, every IV bag, every PPE suit. "Until we have guidance," she said, like guidance was a commodity we could order in bulk. It shifted not with a bang, but with an ugly little negotiation about laundry. The industrial washer in the lower maintenance room is a thing the size of a small car. It had a habit of stalling at 92% and beeping like a smoke alarm you can't find. We were a half shift behind on linens because isolation eats sheets, and Miguel asked me, politely, formally, using the right chain of command, if he could bring 2 men down to help move carts. It was an ordinary request that keeps places like this from grinding themselves into filings, and Warden Calder said no with a flatness that made the air dry. "Trustees remain in their unit," she said, and when Miguel nodded, eyes down but not submissive, I saw him feel a door close in the air. After that, prisoners closed their own doors. Figuratively, they ate quietly. They stopped asking for extras. They watched the monitors on dayroom televisions with heads turned slightly to the side, like dogs listening to far thunder, although those TVs only played DVDs from a not very interesting library of old movies. The island, a self-described colony in the paperwork, became one in behavior. We breathed our own weather. On the 4th night without ferry, Officer Hahn walked out of Unit B and continued walking, as if the hallway were a moving walkway and he couldn't step off. He turned at the corridor intersection on a radius that looked like math, eyes on a fixed point in midair. He wasn't at a run, which would have been easier to respond to. He was at that polite speed that makes people you don't know step aside at airports. When Dana reached for him, he turned toward the contact and this is the part that is hard to make cinematic, he simply didn't stop. Not aggression, but momentum. He moved her back like a tide. She held a line, and I, because of gravity and duty and habit, joined her. Hahn breathed like someone asleep. His thumb pressed his radio's PTT until it beeped at him for holding it too long, and then he pressed it again. We ended up with Hahn in the staff corridor sallyport, gently penned by a maintenance cage rack we wheeled into place and loaded with every 50-pound sack of ice melt we could find. He ran his palms along the mesh like he was pre-flighting a machine. When the PA clicked with an automatic test tone, he oriented. Ari put his stethoscope away and lay his forehead against the glass like a priest at a door. "We can't medicate them asleep forever," he said quietly to me. "These aren't anesthetic doses. They're gentle. I won't put them down like stock." He looked exhausted, then blinked the look away. Sound buys us time. Time. It takes up space on a small island. The turbine-smooth whine of the generator behind the utility shed grew into a personality. The wind had a calendar. Conversations had a way of circling the same landmarks: power, water, food, fuel, people, keys. The control board, normally a friend you ignore, became a patient you can't leave. The inmates began to send messages in the proper way, slips folded and logged, requests for medical review, requests for information, offers of labor, that were, in their tidy script, attempts to be part of the island rather than passengers. I took them to Calder, who initialed each like a judge signing a volume of case law. "We will maintain discipline," she said. "Once the ferry returns, once we have guidance, we can reintroduce the program." At shift change, I found a note taped inside my locker in tidy block letters. "Rookie, Hale, right? If you want your machines to keep spinning, meet me at the laundry after lights. M. Del Rio." It wasn't an invitation to rule break, it was an invitation to conspire against entropy. I went. Miguel was there with Jasper Montero, a rangy man with a scar on his ear and the calm posture of a person who had known forests, plus an older guy whose knees ached by sound. They had carts ready, gloves, and a practical plan. "We're going to keep the washer from sulking," Miguel said. "We'll stay on the right side of the door, and you'll do the part that needs your keys. No harm in washing what already belongs to the island." They didn't cross thresholds. They didn't touch a key. They moved like patients in a lab. I did the lockouts and resets with the sulky machine. We filled carts, ran cycles, and brought the island back one folded corner at a time. Jasper told me he used to be a ranger. "Anderson Island, Nisqually, up into the peninsula sometimes," he said. He knew the waters around McNeil like someone knows the face of a neighbor. He knew who had boats and whose boats had fuel. He assumed I knew the same, and so I did for the length of that conversation. "The ferry crew will be dealing with their own family stuff," he said. "Even if they get her running, they may not be allowed to come. That's a policy problem, not a power problem." That was the first time I let the truth inside as a room I could enter. The ferry might not return. Warden Calder's insistence on protocol, "Our world will be normal when the world is ready," felt like trying to keep a bubble intact in a workshop full of nails. She was not cruel, she was not reckless. She believed that the island's safety sat on the shoulders of the routine, and she was not wrong. But the thing knocking on our perimeter didn't care about routines. It cared about attention and sound. We learned that the hard way when the PA system tested itself again the next morning and 3 infected staff rose within their sally ports and pressed to the edges like iron filings around a magnet. Ari swore under his breath, not a curse, just a frustrated syllable, then pulled the fuse on the PA head end like a dentist snapping a bad root. The control room drained a degree of hum. In the sudden hush, the island felt bigger. "They're going after signal," Ari said to me, voice low enough to be a private property. "Auditory first, maybe vestibular later. If it's a pathogen, it's doing something ugly on the way the brain syncs to rhythm." He stopped himself, knowing that speculating too far made you sloppy. Practical point, we keep it quiet. Quiet is a choice on an island with a prison, a power plant, and a diesel generator that eats noise and spits noise. We did what we could, no drills, no test tones, no PA, no radio chatter that wasn't necessary. We instituted hand signals that would have looked ridiculous a week ago. The inmates followed suit on their own. Day rooms became libraries. People who had talked their way through years learned to speak in glances. It should have made us feel like allies. Instead, it sent the warden's shoulders up a degree. She wanted to be the source of order and found a small civilization building scaffolds without her. "No inmate initiatives," she told me when I mentioned the laundry, and I said nothing because there was nothing I could say that wouldn't be a report. The tipping point came with water. The plant on the island uses a simple sequence that would make an engineer yawn. Pre-filters, pressure vessels, chlorination, Storage tank distribution. One of the pressure relief valves stuck. The control system tried politely to fix it and then stopped. The pump overheated. A shutdown tripped. There were alarms that nobody heard because we had pulled half the building's bells and beeps. When Marcus found it by smell, hot dust and scalded rubber, he called on Channel 3 and we gathered in a way that made the infected in Sallyport stir like grass in a small wind. Maintenance had 2 techs and a folder of printed manuals and plastic sleeves. Jasper, watching through the wire because he had no right to come inside, said softly, "You'll want to check the check valve upstream of the relief. If it's choked, the back pressure will lie to you." It was good advice. It would also have violated a handful of lines written for good reasons. Warden Calder, jaw set, looked at Ari and then at me and then at the plant layout tacked to the wall. "We do not bring inmates into critical infrastructure," she said with the weight of a policy binder. "We do not set that precedent." Marcus spread his hands like a dealer about to flip a card. "We bring a human being with relevant experience to stand where we tell him and point at a part, ma'am. We don't hand him a wrench." The pump clicked a cooling sound that felt like a countdown. Calder's eyes were a room you could only enter if you were sure you could get back out. Finally, she looked at me. "If you take responsibility for his behavior, Officer Hale, I'll authorize him to walk the aisle. He doesn't touch a single thing, not a bolt." Jasper came in with hands out like a person approaching a skittish horse. He pointed. He didn't touch. We vented the line, replaced a check valve the size of a child's fist, and bled air. The pump took a breath and settled into a bass note that sounded like an apology. The storage tank level nudged upward, a digital stream becoming a real river in my brain. I felt a gratitude so sharp it was almost anger. We wrote it up in longhand on lined paper because the computers were a joke. Miguel made coffee for maintenance like he was officiating a treaty. And then, like a stage manager called for it, the power flickered. Generators are machines with dignity until they fail, and then they're just metal. One of ours threw a fit. We lost the admin wing and half the control room screens died in a sick, slow way that reminded me of someone falling asleep in the wrong place. The infected Sallyports were on a different circuit, the right one, and stayed secure. But it made a thought clear in my head like someone wiped a window. If we lost the control room, we'd lose the island. Not because doors would fly open, they wouldn't. They were fail secure, but because we'd be blind. Blind on an island is as good as lost. The problem with a place designed to keep people in is that it's also excellent at keeping help out. Marcus and I stood in the control room and looked at the map board while Ari tallied supplies and Warden Calder revised her lists to account for the power loss. We spoke very softly, because even our thought of a plan made a noise I didn't want the infected to hear, or the warden to dismiss. "We need eyes forward of the island," Marcus said. "We need to know if the ferry is ever coming, if the mainland is an option, if the water between us and it is friendly." I said the word I wasn't supposed to say, boat. Jasper hadn't bragged, he'd merely existed in front of me. There were skiffs on the maintenance float. There were other islands in sight with a handful of year-round residents who knew their weather like relatives. There were options that had the shape of escape without the uglier word. We didn't frame it as an escape. We framed it as recon. That kept it inside the fence of duty. Ari, who had drawn circles under his eyes that you could measure with a ruler, nodded without needing the performance. "If it's a pathogen, the mainland is making bigger decisions than ferries," he said. "We have to stop thinking like a facility and start thinking like a ship." He looked at me. "Ships have logs. Keep one. If you leave, you write where you're going, what you're doing, what you saw, what you'll try to bring back. We don't get to disappear each other." The warden did not authorize it. She ordered the maintenance float gate mechanically locked and the skiff keys placed in the safe that required 2 combinations, neither of which she would share with a rookie. She told me I was not, under any circumstances, to discuss off-island movement with inmates or staff. "Our world is here," she said, and the anger in it was grief. "Our job is to keep this world intact until the other one remembers us." So we kept it intact. We cut noise to the bone. We ran laundry without being seen, because clean fabric is morale in a square shape. We rationed batteries. We pinched the light out of corridors one by one, until the island at night looked like a hunter's moon on a black glove. We hung blankets inside staff dorm windows to kill light signatures. We taught ourselves to love the smell of bleach because it meant we had enough. And the infected staff learned us. They weren't wild. They were precise in the way a compass needle is precise. They oriented to sound and to certain kinds of motion, big, broad gestures more than small, patient ones. They settled when we settled. They moved when we forgot. I began to say hello to them by name in my head, because it let me frame what we were doing as care. They were my co-workers, caught in a weather no one could predict. Corey, Han, Dana, and then 2 more whose names I won't write because their families might be real people reading a word that lands wrong. We brought them water and soft food and removed items that could turn accidental to dangerous. We did not turn our backs, not because we were afraid of attack, but because we had learned that they could put weight where weight should not be. The last thing that made me believe the inmates were not our problem was a small act of stubborn human kindness. Miguel sent a tray to medical with 2 extra yogurts, the kind that tastes faintly of sugar and Plan B for staff only. He slid a note under the plastic like a fortune. "Eat before decisions." Ari found it, ate one, and put the other in the staff fridge with a label that said whoever needed it could have it. It was gone in an hour, and no fight erupted, and the island did not tilt. I kept the note and used it as a bookmark in the SOP binder because it said more about what we were doing than all the laminated pages. What we needed was an explanation, and what we got was a new symptom. Around midday, when the generator ran smooth and the wind came off the sound with the smell of distant kelp and traffic that no longer flowed, Dana, in her Sallyport, began to hum. It wasn't a song I recognized. It wasn't anything I could place inside a radio. It was a simple pulse. 4 notes, stair-stepped and back again, over and over, so quiet you'd miss it if you thought too loud. The others followed at different times, an irregular choir, a pattern that felt like Morse without the code. When the building creaked, they oriented. When someone coughed on the far side of a corridor, they turned in a small, calm wave. It was that new, quiet sound that pushed my fear from gut to plans. Sounds travel across water like promises. If this thing in them was a tuning, then the island was a bell. If the mainland had more bells, then there were more of them. And if there were more of them, the ferry was not a ferry anymore. It was a bridge no one could afford to lower. We formed our own command, not in opposition to the warden, but in a parallel that had less paperwork. Marcus, me, Ari, and 2 line officers who had confessed to each other in a look that we trusted the others not to be fools. We brought Jasper in at the edge. He stayed at the edge because he respected the line. We met in the maintenance corridor with the pump that no longer lied. We spoke in a whisper that still felt too loud. The plan we made was the kind you can hide inside the job description and then execute in a straight line. It had 3 parts: get eyes on the water, control the sound, and prepare a way off that didn't look like an escape until it was already safer than staying. The first meant using the high ground, the water tower, and the admin roof. The second meant building a sound larder, sound you could serve to draw attention away and sound you could starve to keep quiet. The third meant getting keys to the skiff that weren't in the warden's safe. The island was a machine made of metal and policy. Every engineered thing has a bypass if you are careful and, above all, kind. We were careful, and we resolved to be kind even to the people who were not themselves and would not remember. We were going to take their security and use it to keep them alive. That meant being the kind of thieves who leave a receipt. Marcus and I took the tower at dusk while Ari sat with the Sallyport, and the inmates moved laundry in a choreography we would deny if asked. The tower ladder was honest steel. The air up there smelled like toffee and salt. Puget Sound light likes to make a liar out of the clock. From that height I could see Steilacoom, the gray line of the ferry landing, and the neon of a tavern that used to be a landmark. There were no ferry lights. On Anderson Island beyond, 2 homes showed warm squares. A small boat left one, carved a soft V, and turned back as if it had touched an invisible fence mid-channel. Beyond everything, the highway glow by Tacoma was a bruise. I had the cheap binoculars from the control room strap biting my neck and the sense, heavy as a key ring, that the world had gone wide and we had to grow into it very fast. We built our sound pantry out of practical lies. Maintenance had battery-powered bullhorns for shoreline drills. We placed one in a weatherproof box at the far end of the dock and ran a line so we could key it from the control room. The kitchen had timers that clicked and dinged. We used only the click, covered the ding with a folded dish towel, and learned the rhythm that drew attention but didn't alarm. We tested in millimeters like engineers. The infected lifted their heads when our sounds asked politely and returned to stillness when we shushed. It was not training, not truly. It was tide work. The keys were harder and simpler. There was a spare set in maintenance for the skiff if someone had to take it out to clear kelp from an intake or meet a contractor boat at the float. The spare set was in a small red box with a break glass front that made a big statement and a very small sound. We made the sound small enough to be nothing. Ari kept the infected in conversational stillness with murmured nonsense while I used a piece of tape, a flathead screwdriver, and a promise to the universe not to become the person who breaks rules for fun. The glass came out in a square and remained whole. The keys came out of the box. The box went back to its duty with its insides empty, and unless you loved it enough to check, no one could tell the difference. I wrote a note on a 3x5 card to put where the keys had been. We are borrowing this to maintain the island. Officer E. Hale, 1926. It made me feel like a person. We told the warden we were conducting shoreline inspections and sound checks, and she nodded because those were the right words, and because she was keeping 12 plates spinning with 2 hands. She refused then, and would later refuse, to say the word disease, and would not say the word outbreak. There are leaders who keep a thing calm by naming it, and leaders who keep it calm by refusing to. She was the second, and I don't have a smart comment for that because I'm not sure what I would have done in a chair like hers with the mainland refusing to pick up. When I finally set foot on the maintenance float at night, skiff key ring cool in my palm, the water under the slats sounded like breath. The skiff was a welded-aluminum utility boat with a tiller throttle, a clean hull, and a locker that smelled like oil and rope. Jasper looked at it like some people look at old cars. "She'll get us there and back if we ask the water nicely," he said. I asked why he trusted me, a rookie with a face that still had academy on it, and he shrugged in a way that didn't dismiss me. "Because you're doing your job like it matters, and not like it's an exercise," he said, "because you said please to a machine." He wore the gray t-shirt state correctional issues give to everyone who stopped being their clothing size a decade ago. He stood on the dock like a ranger looking at a trail, and for a moment the uniform I wore felt like a two-way door. We did not leave that night. We rehearsed leaving, starting the motor without waking the island, handling the lines, the slow drift that would keep us off the pilings before we gave water to the prop. We made small sound and watched for response. The infected did not stir. The wind shifted, and the mainland smelled like wood smoke. It could have been a fireplace. It could have been 10 things that weren't in a line. When we finally went, we didn't tell anyone except the people who could stop us if they thought we'd lost our minds. Marcus was on the pier with a portable light hooded in his palm like he was palming a coin. Ari stood near Sallyport and breathed. Miguel had somehow watched the clock without ever looking at it. Jasper and I climbed in and the skiff settled like a dog making room. The motor coughed once, low, cooperative. The island made no comment. The water did the thing it always does, which is accept. I kept the bow low, used just enough throttle to make steerage, and aimed not for the pier opposite, too obvious, but for the dark seam between 2 points of land where a private dock had a habit of putting out a light like a welcome home sign. We ran along our own island first, listening for the sound that would call our infected co-workers to the edge, and heard only the generator's patient voice and the whisper of trees. The mainland was a shape. Lights were there, and also gone. The night was full of speed without sound. That was our fear. I thought of the warden asleep in a chair, of the administrative door hinge that always needed more grease, of Aries' careful hands, of Corey's hummed 4-note pattern, of the smell of laundry when it is clean and cheap and perfect. Halfway across, we killed the motor and drifted. Sound carries in even the most forgiving air. In that pause, I heard it. Not out there, not from the mainland, but from behind us, on our island. An answering hum like the one Dana had found. Not one voice, but several, a spread-out choir, not urgent, but aware. They knew the skiff had moved. Not that we had betrayed them. That something had shifted in their river. It made me want to turn back like you do when you feel a pocket go empty and can't remember what should be inside. Jasper touched the gunwale with 2 fingers. "It's okay," he said to the water, as if the water were nervous. He told me to give her a whisper of throttle and to steer for shadow, when shadow exists because shadow is forgiveness. He did not ask me to decide if we were leaving or scouting. We were doing both. To keep myself from spinning into fear, I inventoried the items in the skiff locker. A coiled line with a bowline someone tied beautifully, a deck brush that had been used until its bristles found humility, a flare kit with expired dates that still made me feel better just by being heavy, and a first aid box that had been opened recently and neatly closed again. Every item had been used by a person who cared. We reached the mainland near a driftwood-kicked beach west of the Steilacoom ferry landing and beached so soft that the boat hardly admitted to it. 2 houses sat with their lights out. 1 car on the road showed a dome light and not much else. We pulled the skiff above the tide line and walked up the wooden steps to the public path. Not trying to be invisible, but also not insisting on being seen. I expected, what? Sirens shouting? The white noise of a modern city that won't shut up. What we walked into was a town turned down to 1 on the volume knob. The tavern I had seen from the tower wore its neon dark. The ferry landing had yellow tape strung across its approach like warning and apology. A paper sign zip-tied at 2 corners said, "Service suspended until further notice, public health order." Someone had added "sorry" in marker, like a friendly cashier who had run out of a thing you wanted. We were not heroes, so we didn't break into buildings or search out people like first responders. We were scouts. We took pictures with a duty cell phone whose camera made everything look like an evidence photo. We listened. In the far distance, I heard a helicopter that never got closer. It could have been a medical flight to a hospital that still had a runway of beds. We saw a woman on a porch 3 blocks away smoking a cigarette down to the filter with the posture of a person who'd had that habit long and found nothing else to do with her hands. We did not call out to her. We did not make her choose to answer. We didn't know what we were carrying on our clothes or our breath. We didn't know what answering would cost her. We left a note on the ferry landing bulletin board in thick block letters. McNeil Island Core Facility, staff and inmates stable, need fuel, medical supplies, info, no ferry, we can receive small boat, leave message here or flash too long at midnight from pier. It was a silly little thing in a scripted disaster, but it gave my hands a job and gave the island an address. Jasper stapled it up with a small, satisfied click, and we stood back, and it looked both official and absolutely not enough. On the return, the sound felt colder, as if the water had read our note and found it lacking. The island was a cutout against the sky. The infected were quiet, or at least their song was low enough for the generator to drink. We docked with a kiss of hull to float that would not have woken a cat. Marcus's hooded light drew us to the right cleat, and his hand closed on the bowline with the relief that has no swagger. Ari was at the top of the ramp with a clipboard, because even if you make a new job, you have to treat it like one. We reported. Warden called her, listened with her arms crossed, and her jaw in the state of kind that looks like hard until you know the difference. She asked 3 questions, all practical. Did you see law enforcement? Did you see medical presence? Did you see anything that looks like an organized response? No, and only in the far shape of a helicopter. She looked at the note we left and asked whether we had indicated that inmate labor was being used to assist critical functions. I said no, because it wasn't that kind of report, and also because I was a coward for the right reasons. She didn't argue. She told us, in a voice like a locked drawer, that until further notice, off-island travel was restricted to her authorization only. Marcus stood next to me and said "understood" in a tone that meant, "We will call it that until we call it something else." The island loosened a notch after that, not because we had permission, but because we had a path. We began to move supplies to a position where a small boat could load without a parade. Fuel in approved containers, a medical kit repacked with the needs Ari circled in pen, water jugs with their caps tethered. We kept the infected calm with our pantry of quiets. We rotated officers so exhaustion didn't turn us into new patients. We kept laundry impossible to notice and therefore vital. We took the sound of a spoon in a mug out of the control room because it was exactly the frequency that made Dana stand like a tuning fork. When the first reply came, it wasn't from the bulletin board. It was light. 2 long from the mainland pier at midnight, then another 2, exactly as our note had said. It could have been a coincidence. It could have been a prank by a teenager with a flashlight and a good memory. It felt like the sound itself had written back. We stood on the admin roof and counted the seconds, and then a third pair came like an echo that had decided to be new. It took another day to turn that into anything. The island doesn't hurry, even when you beg it. We returned the lights with a long, short, long, which is polite in a world where everyone uses learned codes to mean "I see you." We sent the skiff out again, this time with a real shopping list and a real plan to trade, fuel for supplies, information for relief, quiet for quiet. We didn't bring inmates across that line, not because they wouldn't have helped, but because once you cross that line you have to answer a different set of questions for the rest of your life. Jasper understood. He stayed at the float, an anchor in a human shape. Miguel sent us with a bag of hard candy that he said worked miracles on morale. The second mainland trip gave us a doctor who wasn't ours for 9 minutes on a dock. He said words that weren't official but were true enough for battlefield use. A neurologic syndrome with rapid onset. A cluster of auditory and motor symptoms. High fever, short prodrome, flattening of affect, preservation of gross strength, loss of inhibitory control. He had nothing to give us by way of treatment besides best nursing practices we were already fumbling toward. Hydration, cooling, quiet, Gentle restraint only when necessary, minimize stimulation. And don't let them go, he said, not unkindly, meaning don't let them walk into the water or the road or the line of a moving thing. He had a bandage on his forearm and tired eyes, and the sight of someone who had learned to cry in elevators where no one could see. The third trip brought fuel in exchange for 2 sealed boxes of antibiotics we weren't using yet and would have returned with thanks later if the world allowed for returns. We moved the cans like we were moving a sleeping child. The generator drank and thanked. Ari rationed sedatives like a monk with candles. The inmates continued not to be our problem and continued to be our solution, and if you think those 2 sentences are the same shape, you understand more about custody than most. We wrote everything down because the act of writing made the island feel like a ship, and ships keep logs, or they stop being ships and become wrecks. The 4th trip was the one that nearly turned us into something we couldn't return from. We found, on the mainland dock, a small group with backpacks and eyes that tracked our skiff like predators track meat. They weren't infected. They were very much alive in the anxious way the healthy get when the world shrinks to a circle around their feet. They wanted the island because it was an island. We wanted the island because it had a limited number of beds, a finite number of keys, and a small population we had finally coaxed into a shape that didn't tip. We said the word quarantine as a shield and a promise. They said the word safe like a plea. We left them with water and a written map to an emergency shelter inland that may or may not have been open. We felt like villains, and then like administrators, and then like exactly what we were: custodians of a place with hard edges. That night, after we returned, Warden Calder called me into her office. She was thinner. She'd started to carry a small notebook instead of a binder. She asked me to sit and didn't make me stand until told otherwise, which felt like an award. "You have made choices," she said. It wasn't a question. I said yes because there isn't any other answer that holds together. She nodded and looked at the wall like it had maps I couldn't see. I refused to explain what the mainland was doing because I didn't have an explanation that would fix anything, she said with a calm that hurt. I see now that I was hoarding silence like a resource. That's not leadership, it's fear. Thank you for not letting my fear become our policy. She authorized the skiff trips formally then, which made everything easier and also strangely harder, because now we were under orders, and orders bring paperwork. She authorized inmate labor in the laundry and the plant under direct supervision, something she would never have done in another season, and which made the island run like a clock you don't take for granted anymore. She stood in front of the staff who were still themselves and told the truth we had been acting on for days, that the inmates were not the threat and the infected staff were. She told the inmates the same, with a formality that made Miguel's eyes shine, and she told them what boundaries remained because she was still a warden, and boundaries are the difference between a place and a mob. On the 7th day without a ferry and the 3rd with a skiff, the infected song changed. It came from the sally ports like a wave front and traveled through the building not as sound but as something you feel in your jaw. Ari read the monitors and watched their temperatures and said a thing I would never have thought to hear in a prison. "They're resolving," he said. "The fever is breaking in some, pushing into a second phase in others. This may be a tide, not a flood." He was careful to tell us that hope is not a plan. He explained in simple words that some would return through a fog and some would not return at all, not through violence but through internal failure that was already underway, and that we were not gods and could not change that line. The day after that, we took the skiff not to the mainland but to a barge moored off a small point, a contractor's work platform with a crane quiet as a dinosaur. On the deck sat pallets of things that would keep a small island alive for another 2 weeks. It was a gift from someone who did not sign the card, probably a civilian emergency effort, possibly a coordination by a county office that had turned into a kitchen table operation. The barge's crew waved like people at a parade. We loaded fuel and water and the kind of medical supplies that say, "We don't know, but we care." We looked like thieves because that is the shape of survival when the receipt printer is offline. We left a note with the pallet wrap that said we'd settle up, and we signed it with a long list of names, staff names, inmate names, the island's name. The island felt like a person who had accepted you into their house. When I slept that night, I dreamed of locks. Not ones that shut, but ones that held. The keys weighed what they always weighed. They rang on my belt in the practical music of this job. The difference was that when I woke, the first words in my head were not orders or fear. They were inventory, people, fuel, water, food, time, sound, keys. And under all of it, like a keel under a boat, a sentence that had changed its subject. The prisoners weren't the threat. The ones who had sworn to guard were the ones we had to guard. The next week would bring a ferry, not the ferry, but a boat that held the letters of a state agency and a crew made of volunteers and borrowed time. It would bring a new list, this one made of names of families of staff who had not heard from them, and a rule about contact that said we would not bring the island's breath to the mainland, or the mainland's to us. It would bring a slow return for some infected staff, a patchwork of recovered selves and holes where things used to be. It would bring paperwork, which meant we had kept enough of the world for paperwork to matter. It would bring, finally, a thing I had not expected to want more than sleep. A calendar with a ferry schedule printed large enough to read across a room, and the knowledge that if it failed again, we knew how to be an island. But before all of that, we had the night when the island sang and we sang back, most of us human and some of us caught in a strange tide, and the sound held us like a bowl. We had a warden who stepped off the narrow track of rules onto the wider road of care. We had an inmate with a coffee pot who wrote fortunes on orange paper, and a ranger who didn't touch a valve and fixed it anyway, and a rookie who wrote receipts for borrowed keys because he didn't know any other way to remain himself. We had a list on a clipboard of what we owed and to whom, and at the top it said, in Ari's neat hand, "Restitution where possible, dignity where not." That's what I learned on the island that went silent. Not that the world can end like a light switch, everyone knows that. What you learn, if you're lucky enough to be trapped with good people, is that small routines are a language and you can use them to tell each other the truth when the big words won't come. We told it to each other in folded towels and quiet radios and careful steps, and the way we called each other by name, even when the person wearing the name could not answer. We held the island together, not with force, but with attention. If you need a moral to make sense of it, maybe it's this. Security is not a wall. It's a promise you keep without being asked. The infected guards, the ones we thought were our defense, became the reason we had to defend our promise. The inmates, the ones we were told to fear, were the ones who helped us keep it. The ferry, which we thought was our lifeline, became an irrelevance until it wasn't. Keys stayed heavy. Water stayed wet. The sound stayed a border and a blessing. And when the world remembered us, we were still here because we had remembered each other first. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.